The Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Ireland, 16th century. A place where there were neither flags nor fixed borders, only shipping routes, winds, and tides. Along the coast of Mayo, the power of the Tudor dynasty weakened and crumbled. Control on land meant nothing here. Power over maritime transport belonged to a woman who commanded a fleet, one who would levy passage fees and decide who would be allowed to trade and who would sink. Her name was Gráinne Ní Mháille. Clúibé fell calm first, then came the sound of waves. Square-rigged ships drifted aimlessly, sails slack, rudders useless. The bay was a labyrinth of islands and rocky outcrops, channels known only to those who grew up on these waters. English captains waited for the wind, but it did not come. Their cannons pointed toward the horizon, ready for threats they could see. They had not yet detected that movement. From behind the low islands and jagged cliffs, long, narrow hulls emerged. These were war galleys. Oars dropped gently into the water, rhythm steady, disciplined. Triangular sails were taut and ready not to chase the wind, but to capture its last breath. These ships were built for this bay, for this depth, for this moment. They moved in places where deep-keeled vessels could not turn around. This was not a naval battle. This was a trap closing shut. The English warships tried to change course. Sails creaked and groaned. Orders were shouted. There was no response. Without wind, all their power evaporated. Cannons still had ammunition, but were useless, firing inaccurately because targets were too close and too fast. The war galleys advanced from blind spots, where square sails obscured vision and high sides hindered reaction. The principle here was simple: control the people, not the ship. The first shots did not aim at the hull. They cut the rigging. Ropes snapped. Masts lost tension. Every chance of escape was severed in seconds. Grappling hooks flew through the air. Oars reversed. The galleys pulled in hard, pressing against the taller ships like knives thrust into exposed flanks. Boarding happened immediately. There was no prolonged exchange or any negotiation. Armed groups surged over the railings, moving with practiced speed. This was not piracy in the chaotic sense. This was seizure. Officers were isolated first. The helmsman was dragged away. Resistance collapsed once command was broken. The battle ended where it truly mattered, between people, not between pieces of wood. Within minutes, English flags were lowered. Cargo holds were secured. Crews were bound or recruited depending on their value as goods. The sea quickly returned to the silence it had before being disturbed. This was how power operated in Clúibé. The attack did not require numerical superiority or firepower. It required knowledge of wind direction, of tidal pull, of calm waters where large ships became helpless. The English Navy was built to operate on the open sea and in large-scale battles. Here, that strength became a weakness. The war galleys withdrew as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing into channels that no outsider dared follow. The bay revealed nothing. To London, this loss would seem like robbery or disaster. But to those who lived here, it was enforcement of authority. Only afterward was the final truth revealed. Those orders were not given by a man. The image of a woman on the lead ship giving commands without hesitation made it certain her power could not be doubted. She did not fight for attention, but chose to observe opportunities. She decided when to attack and when to withdraw. Her presence did not interrupt command, but rather perfected it. So who was this formidable woman? Gráinne Ní Mháille did not defeat English warships by confronting them head-on one by one. She made their advantages meaningless. Her war was not aimed at destroying the fleet. It was aimed at controlling movement, forcing compliance, and reminding every merchant captain that passage here was conditional. What happened in Clúibé would not be recorded as an official battle. There would be no declarations of victory, no memorial monuments. But trade routes would be adjusted. Insurance costs would increase. Captains would negotiate before setting sail. That was the measure of success. This type of warfare gave no warning. It accumulated gradually. Each intercepted shipment weakened supply chains deep inland. Each captured officer sent a message that power did not come only from the crown. It came from whoever controlled access. On land, English royal authority could levy taxes, appoint sheriffs, rewrite laws. At sea, especially here, those tools became useless. The ocean recognized no ordinances or patents. It only recognized force applied at the right moment. Gráinne Ní Mháille understood this better than anyone in the bay. Her power was mobile. It could not be besieged. It could not be starved out. It appeared where the enemy was weakest and vanished before the enemy could organize a counterattack. This was not rebellion in the conventional sense. This was parallel rule. The English would eventually call it piracy. That term would be used to simplify what they could not reconcile into their system. But piracy implied chaos. What operated here was structure, scheduling, intelligence, discipline, a network that functioned regardless of who held power in London. The battle in Clew Bay ended without spectacle, without ceremony. But its logic would repeat itself along the western coast. Each time the question became more acute. If ships obeyed her terms, if commerce yielded to her will, if royal authority could not enforce its power beyond the shoreline, then who truly ruled these waters? And what kind of empire was being challenged not by armies but by someone who completely refused to fight on land? Entering the 16th century, Ireland was not an empty land waiting for England. It already had laws, lineages, and order. What Ireland lacked was uniformity. Power was local, negotiated, and personal. Along the western edge, where land poured into the sea, power here became even more sparse. The Atlantic was not a frontier. It was a thoroughfare. In London, Henry VIII proclaimed himself King of Ireland. On paper, this island was annexed. In reality, very little changed initially. The Tudor dynasty did not conquer Ireland in a single campaign. They gradually fragmented the country, replacing the network of Gaelic obligations with a centralized legal institution. This method was more administrative than military. This policy was called surrender and regrant. Gaelic lords were invited to surrender their titles to the English crown, only to receive them back under English law. In return, they abandoned Brehon law, accepted common law, and ruled as royal tenants rather than autonomous chieftains. On land, this policy began to take effect. But in coastal areas, it did not. Brehon law was not written for a centralized state. It was built for communities that resolved conflicts through compensation, kinship, and reputation. It allowed women to own property, inherit, divorce, and most importantly, lead if they could command loyalty. Power was not symbolic. It was proven continuously. Common law demanded something else: fixed jurisdiction, permanent offices, sheriffs accountable to the crown. It assumed that power was immutable, tied to territory that could be mapped and taxed. Along the Atlantic coast, these assumptions collapsed. Coastlines changed. Ports sprang up like mushrooms. Control moved with the ships. This was the fracture line. From Dublin and London, Ireland was supposed to be governed internally from the center. From the west, power oriented outward toward trade routes connecting Spain, France, and the Atlantic world. Royal influence weakened the further it extended from ports it could not fully control. The Tudor solution was escalation. They established fortifications and garrisons. Governors were appointed with military power. The goal was to pin down those who would not stand still. But each fortress needed resupply. Each garrison depended on unsafe sea routes. The terrain itself undermined this solution. Coastal territories like Umhall existed in this gap. Too maritime to be ruled like inland territory. Too politically fragmented to be fully annexed. These areas became gray zones of power, nominally under royal authority but in practice autonomous. London understood this as chaos. In reality, it was competition. English royal authority held a monopoly. Only one legitimate government could exist. Gaelic Ireland did not operate on that premise. Multiple overlapping powers could coexist as long as they were recognized locally. On land, this coexistence was being eroded, yet at sea it remained intact. The Atlantic only highlighted the difference. Commercial traffic increased on western routes. Fish, wine, salt, timber, and weapons were transported constantly. Whoever controlled the shipping routes controlled revenue, and whoever controlled revenue controlled loyalty. England had warships and cannons, but what they lacked was understanding of the coastline. Their navy was designed for open waters to protect commerce from foreign nations, not to patrol hundreds of small bays, straits, and island chains. They could punish, but could not monitor everything at once. This created a paradox that the Tudors could not resolve quickly. To dominate Ireland, they had to find a way to dominate the coastal areas. To dominate the coastal areas, they had to rely on those already familiar with them. But those people already held power. The crown responded by redefining legitimacy. Anyone who used force at sea without royal license became criminal. Private power was then judged to be piracy. Governance was reduced to two extremes, either legitimate or illegitimate, only defined as royal or rebel, with no concept existing between them. They gave only two choices, either right or wrong. But this redefinition came too late. By the time Tudor officials began mapping the West seriously, systems had already been established. Unofficial fees, protection agreements, maritime law enforcement, not by officers but by fleets, under the command of local rulers. These systems were not recorded in central archives but were visible to every captain who sailed there. This was the world Gráinne Ní Mháille inherited. Not a frontier but a multi-layered battlefield of law, custom, and commerce. Her power would not only rise to confront the state but also in the growing gap between how empires thought power operated and how it actually operated. The context was not an ordinary uprising but a prolonged struggle over definition itself. Who decides what is considered a rule? Who decides where the boundaries of law begin and end? So what happens when an empire built on land confronts a force that exists entirely at sea? Gráinne Ní Mháille was born into a system that already regarded the sea as heritage. Around 1530 in Mháille, on the west coast of Ireland, seafaring skills were not a profession. They were lineage. The outweigh Mháille clan did not just rely on land to build power. They harvested power from movement. Ships, crews, and routes were the core assets of the clan. From childhood, Gráinne was trained not as an exception but as a participant. Brehon law did not prohibit her from owning or commanding. It only posed a question: could she maintain loyalty? On these waters, competence was demonstrated clearly and immediately. A ship either moved when ordered or did not. Here there was no abstraction of power. Her learning was practical, navigating through narrow channels, calculating departure times according to tides, reading weather before it occurred. These skills were not romantic. They were logistical. They determined survival and profit. In this environment, Gráinne's gender mattered less than her reliability. This did not mean this world was equal. It only meant the rules were different. Throughout Europe, power was gradually becoming rigid and concentrated in bureaucratic structures dominated by men. Titles were passed along fixed lines. Offices became permanent. In Gaelic-speaking Ireland, especially along the coast, leadership remained conditional. It had to be proven many times. Gráinne gradually adapted to this expectation rather than fighting against it. Marriage here did not stem from love, but was considered an alliance, not destiny. The first marriage bound her to the O'Flaherty clan, extending maritime influence southward. It was strategic consolidation, not retreat from power. When her husband died, she did not disappear into dependence. She returned to Mháille with ships, followers, and experience. This moment was crucial. By English standards, widowhood was a contraction. Under Brehon law, it was an expansion. Gráinne reasserted her power. She took control of fleets and coastal strongholds. Power was not inherited silently. It was reclaimed publicly. Those who followed her did so because she provided, protected, and succeeded. Her choice to concentrate power at sea was deliberate. Land could be occupied and controlled by garrisons. Ships could not. A fleet could withdraw, reappear, or disperse without losing cohesion. This mobility became her shield. Gráinne's command style was direct. She did not rule from great halls. She ruled from decks and shore camps. Orders were given in places where consequences were immediate. Mistakes could cause loss of goods or lives. This maintained discipline more effectively than any charter contract. Her power expanded through repetition. Escorting merchant ships, enforcing toll collection laws, confiscating ships that refused to comply with agreements. Each action reinforced the previous one. Captains learned that negotiation was cheaper than resistance. Local communities learned that her protection was reliable. What emerged was not chaos but predictability. Gráinne became a critical link in Atlantic commerce. It did not need to control every ship. It needed to control expectations. Once that was established, enforcement became selective rather than continuous. This was governance without paperwork. English officials had difficulty categorizing her. She was not a rebel against the crown. She did not declare independence. She did not occupy cities. Yet she enforced power more consistently than many appointed governors. This ambiguity helped protect her. While Tudor authority increasingly tightened control inland, Gráinne adjusted strategy by expanding outward. She consolidated island bases, maintained high-speed galleys with shallow drafts, built networks of watchtowers and signals. Her territory was not defined by borders but by response time. If a threat appeared, she could act before orders arrived from Dublin. Her gender identity became a secondary issue mainly raised by outsiders. In her system, the calculation was simple. She delivered results. She managed risks. She redistributed profits. Those were the measures of loyalty. By the time English administrators began to recognize her as a problem, she was already too deeply rooted to be easily removed. She was not an individual eccentric with charisma. She was a system operator. This distinction was crucial. Gráinne Ní Mháille did not seek recognition as an equal in the Tudor hierarchical system. She sought irrelevance to that system. Her power did not need English validation to function. It only needed continued access to the sea. And as long as the Atlantic remained beyond complete control, her power remained intact. The problem for the crown was no longer whether she would exist. The problem was whether she could be eliminated without destabilizing the trade routes that England now depended on. That dilemma would determine everything that followed. Gráinne Ní Mháille did not rule through personal charisma. She ruled through organizational strategy. What outsiders perceived as raids were in reality an integrated maritime system built to extract value from movement itself. Power did not come from occupying territory. It came from deciding who was allowed to pass when and under what conditions. The west coast of Ireland was not poor. That was a mistaken judgment. Its wealth did not lie in fields or towns. It flowed along waterways. Fish from the Atlantic, wine from the Iberian Peninsula, salt timber, iron weapons. Ships moving between Galway, Spain, France, and the Irish Sea had to pass through narrow waters. Clew Bay was one of those choke points. Gráinne turned geography into policy. She imposed maritime fees that were not random extractions but predictable charges. Payment ensured safe passage, and refusal meant interception. The logic was clear to every captain: compliance would certainly be cheaper than resistance. This turned violence into governance. Violence was present, but it was not permanent force. Its credibility was what mattered. Her infrastructure reflected this logic. Castles like Rockfleet, Carrick-Kildavnet, and Clare Island were not inland fortresses. They were coastal nodes. Each castle overlooked approach routes, anchorages, or channels. They functioned as supply depots, signal points, and shelters, rather than last-stand defensive fortifications. No castle was designed to withstand prolonged siege. They were designed to support movement. The fleet was the core. Gráinne invested in shallow-draft sailing vessels capable of entering small bays and estuaries where English ships could not follow. Oars made ships independent of wind. Triangular sails captured angles that square sails could not. These ships were not built to dominate in open battle. They were built to appear where the enemy was weakest. Speed mattered more than firepower. Intelligence was gathered continuously. Sentries on headlands tracked the direction of sailing vessels. Smoke and flag signals transmitted information across distances faster than any mounted messenger could do inland. Everything was arranged and operated systematically in motion. By the time an English patrol arrived, the situation had changed. This was asymmetric warfare without ideology. Gráinne did not seek decisive battles. She avoided them. Large engagements favored centralized powers with more abundant reserves. Her system aimed at different goals. It targeted economic stability. Each interrupted voyage increased costs. Each delayed shipment put pressure on inland supply chains. Pressure accumulated silently. The English Navy was powerful, but it was designed to address other problems. It protected convoys against hostile nations. It engaged fleets of comparable size. It relied on formal command structures and predetermined deployment plans. When confronted with Grainne's system, this became rigidity. To effectively intercept ships, English forces needed to be regularly present along the coast, have local knowledge, and respond quickly. This required resources disproportionate to the apparent threat. London hesitated. Dublin improvised. Neither was fully committed. Gráinne exploited this hesitation. Her crews were not uncommitted mercenaries. They were tightly bound to kinship networks. Payment was made regularly. Risks were managed. Seized goods were redistributed at established ratios. Discipline was enforced through authority. Those who betrayed trust were excluded from future profits. In a maritime economy, exclusion was a severe penalty. This created stability. From the outside, her operations were called piracy. The term was useful. It simplified complexity. It framed the conflict as a criminal problem rather than political. But piracy was only episodic. Here operations were continuous. Routes were monitored. Agreements were honored. Retaliation was carefully calculated. Her system also adapted. When pressure increased in one area, operations shifted elsewhere. When English patrols concentrated, she temporarily withdrew instead of escalating. Time favored her. The Crown had to justify spending. She did not. The result was a form of power that did not seek recognition but forced others to acknowledge it. English merchants began negotiating indirectly. Local officials accepted her presence when it helped maintain trade operations. Even coercive actions relied on intelligence, often transmitted through her network. This was governance based on indispensability. Grainne's doctrine rested on a simple principle: never fight where the enemy is strong. Always fight where the enemy cannot stay. The sea allowed this principle to be enforced. It eliminated pursuit routes. It removed fixed fronts. Her power was therefore layered, tactical at the level of individual encounters, strategic at the level of economic flows, political in its consequences. Authorities struggled to respond because they could not attack this doctrine without disrupting the trade system they were relying on. Suppression required permanent disruption. Compromise required acknowledgement. This tension increased as Tudor policy became more rigid. The autonomy initially tolerated would become intolerable once England committed to complete administrative control of Ireland. Grey zones were no longer acceptable. Every authority had to be transparent to the state. Grainne's system contradicted legibility. It left no ledgers, offices, or charters. It existed in movement and memory. To eliminate it, England had to do more than just capture ships. They had to break the social and logistical structures that sustained them. That task would fall to those who believed overwhelming force could substitute for understanding. They would discover that suppressing a maritime system was not the same as defeating an enemy on the battlefield. And by the time they grasped the difference, Gráinne Ní Mháille would adapt again. In 1584, the balance of power shifted. Sir Richard Bingham arrived in Connacht not as a negotiator but as an instrument. His mission was clear: eliminate autonomous power, not weaken it, not absorb it, but end it. Where previous officials tolerated gray zones, Bingham was sent to erase them. He did not start from the sea. Bingham understood that Gráinne Ní Mháille's fleet could not be cornered directly. Instead, he targeted what sustained them. Hostages from allied clans were seized. Crops in inland areas were destroyed. Livestock was confiscated. Coastal communities cooperating with her faced collective punishment. The goal was not confrontation. It was isolation. This was counter-logistics tactics. English forces intermittently blockaded seaports not to win battles but to drain public patience. Trade became riskier. Prices soared. Neutral merchants hesitated. Pressure did not come all at once but accumulated gradually. Then personal shock struck. Owen O'Flaherty, Grainne's husband and ally, was killed in this campaign. Sources vary on the details. Some describe a direct clash. Other sources suggest it was betrayal due to English pressure. What is certain is its consequence. A critical pillar in her network of alliances had been removed. This mattered more than any lost ship. The Tudor strategy was working not because it defeated their fleet, but because it changed their operating environment. Mobility became more difficult as ports were monitored closely. Intelligence became unreliable when informants feared retaliation. The sea remained wide open, but the coastline was tightened. Gráinne faced an unprecedented decision in her career. She could escalate concentrate forces, accept the risk of public confrontation, turn asymmetric warfare into direct conflict, or she could completely change the game. She chose the second option. In 1593, Gráinne Ní Mháille set sail not to raid but to petition. She traveled to England to meet Queen Elizabeth I. This was not submission, this was strategy. By crossing the Irish Sea, she advanced into the only area where Bingham's power weakened. The meeting itself contained much symbolic meaning. Two female leaders separated by culture, law, and political status faced each other on equal political footing. They did not share language. They communicated through interpreters. Protocols were observed. Neither showed deference. Gráinne presented her case not as a rebel begging for mercy, but as a wronged authority demanding justice. She accused Bingham of unlawful actions, violating even English legal norms. She identified herself as a loyal subject whose rights had been violated. This framing was precise. Elizabeth listened not because she admired Gráinne, but because the argument fit Tudor logic. If Bingham had exceeded limits, then discipline must come from above. Central power reasserted its position by restraining its own agents. The result was compromise. Bingham was required to restrain his actions. Gráinne's sons were released. Her maritime operations were reclassified as privateering rather than ordinary piracy. Violence did not end. It was legitimized. This outcome is often misunderstood as either victory or surrender. It was neither. It was transformation. Gráinne converted autonomous power into recognized function without abandoning its core logic. But the cost was real. This agreement bound her family to the Tudor system. Her sons received English titles. They gained protection and status, but the price was transformation. Gaelic autonomy was not passed intact to the next generation. It dissolved into subordination. Gráinne herself continued operations, but within increasingly narrow parameters. Age reduced her ability to lead directly at sea. English government intervention deepened. Gray zones gradually closed. When she died around 1603, her empire did not collapse. Instead, there was annexation. Her system did not fall. It became unnecessary. That was the quiet end of maritime autonomy. In the centuries that followed, Gráinne Ní Mháille became a different icon, a pirate queen, a folk hero, a strange romantic phenomenon. The strategic logic of her faded, replaced by myth. Songs celebrated defiance, not tactics. Stories focused on spectacle, not structure. This is how erasure works, not only through silence but through distortion. By reducing her to an exceptional case, history avoided confronting the system she had built. A woman dominating the seas became noteworthy. A maritime political institution challenging an empire became inconvenient. Yet the truth remains unchanged. She did not defeat the English Empire. She forced this empire to recognize her as a power that could not be ignored. She operated outside its laws long enough that compromise became cheaper than elimination. Her legacy was not rebellion. It was leverage. Gráinne Ní Mháille proved that empires are weakest when their assumptions fail. Tudor England assumed power was territorial, legible, and immutable. She proved that power could be flexible, informal, and durable. When history was written from land, maritime systems disappeared. Fleets left fewer ruins than castles. Routes vanished when trade patterns changed. What remained were only names stripped of context. Gráinne's story matters because it restores that missing logic. She reminds us that power does not need thrones. It needs the ability to control movement. And in that moment on the edge of the Atlantic, that control belonged to a woman who understood the sea better than any empire that ever tried to dominate it. The question she left behind is not whether she was exceptional. It is why so many others like her were erased, simply because they ruled in places historians never knew. Gráinne Ní Mháille did not challenge an empire by defeating it on the battlefield. She did something harder. She forced that empire to acknowledge her as a political entity. Not a rumor, not a criminal designation, a force that needed to be negotiated with. Her power was not based on ideology or spectacle. It was based on systems, on logistics, on the understanding that controlling movement could be more important than controlling land. The Atlantic was her territory, not because she claimed sovereignty, but because she organized it effectively. History rarely preserves such power. Castles only leave ruins. Bureaucratic machinery only leaves archives. Maritime systems only leave wake trails that vanish behind ships. When historians later rewrote Ireland's story from the roots, the sea had receded. What remained were only borders, laws, and victories measured by territory. So Gráinne became legend. A pirate queen, a curiosity, a woman out of place. Those titles made it easier to admire her and easier to forget her. What was lost was the lesson her life offered. Empires are not only challenged by armies, they are also challenged by individuals who refuse to follow the rules that empire holds. Gráinne did not seek to overthrow Tudor England. She exploited its blind spots until acknowledging them became unavoidable. Her world did not survive after she departed. It was annexed, adjusted, and renamed. But in a brief moment it proved that power could exist outside the crown, outside the capital, outside written law. The sea does not record victories. It erases them. History decides what is remembered. The question is not why Gráinne Ní Mháille faded from official records. It is why so many maritime powers, so many systems built on movement rather than monumental architecture vanished along with her simply because history was written from land.